Thanks, Ron.
This is Mary Ann Sison and Doug Mansfield, and today we are interviewing Mr. Ray Mitchell. It is October 12th, and we're interviewing for the Veterans History Project. Okay, Mr. Mitchell, we want you to start at the beginning. We're going to be taking notes because this all is going to be indexed, okay? But can you just tell us how you came to be in the Army? Let's start with that.
Well, I ran as hard as I could, but they finally found me. And no, I volunteered out of college and joined the Army, and ended up having basic training in Camp Wheeler, Georgia. Had good training, very good training, and then ended up with the 65th Infantry Division, which was in Camp Shelby. And from there, I volunteered for a special assignment. As it appeared on the bulletin board, it said, "Wanted volunteers for dangerous, hazardous mission in jungle warfare." Well, I was scared to death that I would go somewhere where it was snowing and ice and I would freeze to death. And so I didn't see the dangerous, hazardous mission. All I saw was the palm trees and the beautiful islands where the jungles would be, and I knew I would be safe. However, that's not exactly where I went. I ended up going to the CBI, which stands for China, Burma, and India, or Confusion Beyond Imagination. And there I became a part of a unit. It was called the 5307th Composite Unit. It was better known as Merrill's Marauders, a unit that eventually made history. I did not know about it for many years, as they were historical nature. But we operated behind the Japanese lines anywhere from 100 to 200, 300 miles. And we got all supplies by air. We had no vehicles. Had it not been for the Air Corps at that time and the quartermaster, we would not have been able to stay any time at all. But these people would come over, drop rations, and we also had mules for transporting our heavy equipment, such as the machine guns and mortars, and we had some artillery pieces that we carried with us. But as I said, we stayed behind the lines, and to evacuate our wounded, they came in with the little L1s and L5s, the little single-engine planes, and picked up our wounded and took those out. And those were the bravest men I've ever seen, to come in there with an unarmed plane to pick up the wounded. And our medical people were just so diligent with their task. Of course, the unit was made up of all volunteers, with the exception of some of the medical personnel. And I can recall our battalion surgeon used to joke about the fact, he said he knew that someone was really enjoying his being as a combat sergeant major, battalion surgeon, because prior to going in service, he was a Jewish Fifth Avenue pediatrician, and now he's in combat as the chief surgeon. But he was one of the finest men I ever met. Just such a, you could not frustrate the man. He was there doing whatever is necessary. Our first real heavy encounter with a lot of Japanese was in a place called Michino, Burma. It had two small airstrips and a town. Well, the airstrip was taken first, but then the town, it took still several months to take that. And we were subjected to more or less trench warfare during monsoon season, and conditions were very poor. I recall we had one entire company that was ambushed one day, and a company of about 200, and I think we had 17 men survive that issue. We never had another G Company. After that, G Company was just omitted from our battalion. And then evidently we were not pleasing the higher-ups back in the rear area. We weren't moving as fast as they thought we should. So they decided to send B-25 bombers over to soften the path for us. And of course, since we received everything by parachute, we had lots of parachutes to put out as markers for them to know where we were. Well, they dropped as many bombs on us as they did the Japanese. They killed over 100 men the first time. It's very difficult having to try to dig out friends that are purple from suffocation and body parts everywhere. And having been there a long time and having not had the supplies we really needed, this was just another low blow. And 2 weeks later, they came back and did the same thing again. They bombed us a second time. And this time we had even moved back 100 yards, but they also moved the bombers back 100 yards, and they bombed us again. But fortunately, that was the last time we were bombed by our own planes. We were supported by the old P-40s that would come over and bomb directly in front of us. And those fellows were so good. They could almost put one in your pocket if they needed to. I recall the first time I saw them drop a napalm bomb. It scared us worse than it did the Japanese because we had not seen that and we thought the plane had crashed. But that was one of the most devastating things they could do, is to drop the napalm, because it covered such a wide area and would go down into the bunkers and things of this nature. But when the Michino finally fell, we were depleted. There were so very few of us left. But they had promised us that when the mission is over, you will be sent back to Calcutta, and you will be paid, you will be promoted, and you will get a rest area there. But that isn't what happened. Instead, we were told to pull back and build a camp. We built a camp called Camp Landis. That was for the first marauder killed in Burma. But I think the most degrading thing was, as we moved back from Michino, we were instructed to cover the battlefields that we had been on so long, and to pick up all the explosives, hand grenades, mortar shells, and things of this nature, and put them where when the natives moved back in, it would not hurt them. And then to also try to identify the dead and bury all the dead. And we managed to do this to a certain extent, and I'm sure that some of those will never be found. My battalion at one time had 400 men missing in action, and I had become the sergeant major, and I worked very hard to try to bring that number down and help locate as many as I could. I think eventually we got the list down to 250 missing in action, which was far too many. But then we pulled back into this camp, and we deactivated Merrill's Marauders, and we activated another unit called the 475th Infantry, which became part of a Mars task force, because it was joined then. We were one regiment, so we were joined by another regiment, and it made a brigade. But we retrained, we got new men in, we got new officers in, we got new equipment, and became probably one of the strongest fighting units in the Army. And from there, after we trained, we took off again behind the Japanese lines with our mules and men, and went south in Burma. We stopped several places, had battles, like one place called Tonquah. We encountered a group of Japanese there. You never say combat was nice, because you always have so many casualties. But the Japanese used to, as we understood it, they inducted young men into the military in Japan, And they gave them a couple of weeks of training and uniforms, and then they would send them as a unit against some Chinese somewhere, because the Chinese were ill-equipped and not trained very well. So they would actually give the Japanese recruits on-the-job training. And after they had trained them in combat, then they would often take and send them out into the South Pacific as trained troops. Well, they thought they were going to find some Chinese troops to fight where we were. But unfortunately, they did not find Chinese. They found us, and we were much better equipped than they were. We had so many automatic weapons, and we were all, 90% of us had combat experience. And so consequently, we destroyed the unit. One of the things that happened, we had Nisi, which are Japanese American troops. We had them as interpreters and scouts. We didn't have many of them. But these fellows would crawl out between the lines and listen to the Japanese talking and bring back the information as to what was going to happen. And that first morning when they discovered us, we were already dug in, and they started trying to make an attack. As the Japanese officer would give commands, the Nisi would counter that in Japanese, and got the troops to just turning around in front of, which was just suicide, in fact, before it was over. But the unit was destroyed. We were there probably a month and a half, 6 weeks, something like that. But the unit was their unit was destroyed, and we moved on down through the mountains and went down to the Burma Road. We came in behind them and cut the Burma Road because they were sending supplies. Japanese were sending supplies up the Burma Road to troops to try to go into China. Well, we cut their supplies. And of course, it was very difficult because we had gotten all of our groups together. We had had the entire brigade there. We had 2 regiments, but there were about probably 150,000 of them. But we cut their supplies, and of course they were unhappy about this, and they began to really give us trouble with their heavy guns, the 105s and 155s. But we had a little instance there where we would send down patrols on the Burma Road at night to destroy the trucks that were trying to get by. And one night we sent a group down, and we put 2 men out with bazookas to shoot the 2 first trucks to stop the traffic, because they couldn't get around. Then we could destroy the rest of them. So one fellow was designated as number 1, one is number 2. Number 1 was to shoot the first truck, number 2 to shoot the second truck, and this would seal the road. Well, the scout came and said, "We got a problem. The first truck is a tank." And he said, "But it's not one of the big ones, it's a smaller tank." And he said, "And the second thing is the second truck is a tank." But everything was concluded that the fellows can take care of that. He's right there by the road. He can knock it out with that bazooka. Well, the first tank passed number 2 and nothing happened, and he passed number 1 and nothing happened. But when number 2 tank got to number 2 gunner, he hit him with a bazooka and caught him on fire. And number 1 tank got excited. You could hear him racing that engine, trying to get in reverse, and it sounded like a kid the first time he ever tried to shift a Model A forward. You could hear those gears, you could hear him roaring, and the turret would only turn 180 degrees, so he couldn't turn and shoot at us. Well, finally, he did get it in reverse, and of course he had it so many RPMs, he came flying back toward the other tank, and it rolled up on the other tank and turned over on the side. Well, his first mistake was getting in reverse. He should have just gone on down the road and been with his friends, but when he turned over, his second mistake, he opened the door to see where he was and found out. But after it was all over, someone asked this fellow, "Why didn't you shoot the first tank?" And his comment was, "Didn't say nothing about no tank. and I ain't seen a truck yet. So he shot the tank. He didn't shoot the tank, or he was waiting for a truck to come along. But it wasn't long after this before we were pulled out and we went on down to Burma Road and came to where they had a good network of roads all the rest of the way down to Burma, through Burma to Rangoon. And the British had a lot of troops there, so they took over because they could use their tanks and heavy weapons. And what was left, those that were left of us, we went over into China. And in China, we were there for quite a while, and we're preparing, I guess, to defend. You know, why we were in China was to keep as many Japanese there as we possibly could, to keep them from going down to the islands. But this, when the war ended, I still had quite a few men, and so we turned and went back to our headquarters in Kunming to go home. And we got to Kunming, and they didn't even want us to unload the trucks because we were the only infantry. And the Civil War had started that day. So we ended up going down into downtown Kunming and had a ringside seat for the Civil War. And it was almost comical because we put our flag out, we put our machine guns out, and they could recognize us as Americans. And they would walk down the street and we would wave at them, throw them cigarettes. We didn't care which side they were on. And of course, it's kind of nice to be neutral sometimes in a situation like that, but eventually they left town and we were able to get on back into India and catch a ship and come home. I think one of the things that still bears on my mind was the little sign over a cemetery in Burma that stated, "When you go home, tell them for us that we gave our today for their tomorrow." And I thought that was a story that would tell itself. But we did get aboard a ship, ended up in Tacoma, Washington, and for me, this made a trip around the world. I left from the Atlantic side, came back the Pacific side. And as a dog face, that's not bad to make a trip around the world. But I don't care to do it again.
Let's back up a little bit and explain to me, if you will, why the American troops were in Burma. What was your mission?
The mission in Burma, the Japanese had taken all the seaports from China, Indochina, and Burma, so no supplies could come in by water. For a long time they came in through Burma, and they could go up the river. They had rail lines, and they also had a highway that they could get up to the Burma Road, and then from the Burma Road they could be trucked over into China. Well, when they took all the ports, that means that everything had to be transported to China by air over the hump, which was a very dangerous thing. I think 20,000 feet was as high as the tallest mountain, but the weather conditions were so bad there that the planes were, I think the trip was about 500 and something miles, but there were so many planes that had crashed. They oftentimes called it the aluminum trail because they had these, I don't know much about flying, but they call them downdrafts and things of this nature, where the plane would sometimes be flying along and drop as much as 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 feet. But that was the purpose of us going to begin with, is to try to break the gridlock and to get a route where that you could take stuff to China from India. And evidently, of course, the planes were doing such a tremendous job flying the hump because they just took tons and tons and tons of supplies and men. But incidentally, we were the only infantry, combat infantry, in China, Burma, and India. And at the most, we had about 6,000 men after we doubled it. It started out with 3,000 and was eventually up to 6,000. We were not like the troops over in Europe where you had so many of them. In fact, just to get replacements was hard. I recall one time I had to go back to our rear, and I got flown back there, and I saw these young fellows walking along in strange-looking uniforms. And I stopped one of them. I said, "Say, friend, what kind of uniform is that you have on?" And he threw his shoulders back and he said, "This is combat gear, soldier. Where you been?" The material had to come all the way across India, and sometimes it didn't quite make it all the way. But of course, we had sufficient. We had sufficient.
What was it like living there? I know your supplies were being dropped. There were probably times when you had to fend for yourself. What was life like in the CBI?
Well, you learn to eat light. They've tried to drop to us every 3 days when we were on the move. And when we went into combat, they tried to drop to us just about every day, and dropping food, medications, and supplies. Ammunition came first, and mule feed came second, because we had to feed the mules. And then we lived on sea rations primarily, and we learned to supplement that with the Japanese rice, because we learned very quickly that the Japanese lived mostly on rice and things of that nature that they carried on their backs. So when we overran them, we always took their rice, and that was always our supplement, because you could take some rice and put it in a helmet and get it cooking pretty good, and put 2 cans of sea rations in that and feed 5 men. And sometimes you were hungry for a day or two, but when you think of the reason you're there and the factor that you are 150, 200 miles behind the Japanese lines, you don't worry as much about food as you do your skin. There were some close times, yes, and we lost lots of men. But to begin with, the first campaigns, 60% of our casualties were because of the jungles. And this is one of the things that we learned, was to take better care of ourselves. In my battalion, you did not go without a shirt, and if you were anywhere near combat, you made sure that you had your helmet on. That was a necessity. A helmet, we found out after we were out of combat that you're not supposed to cook in one, because it takes the temper out of it, and it makes it too easy to make a hole in it. But they didn't tell us that until we got out of combat. Oh, I've had some fine meals out of a helmet. But those old helmets, I've got one at home, and I just didn't realize how heavy that thing was until such time as I tried to put it on. But you adjusted to just about what you had to. To begin with, it was some of the hardest living. You were in mud, water, and we talk about down on the coast now with all of the storms that we need to boil our water, and we need to do this and do that. Can I recall when we just take a canteen and reach over in a rice paddy and fill it with water. And of course, this is why we had 60% casualties from it.
So the diseases got to you then?
Yes, yes. Lots of fevers and lots of things of that nature that took so many men out. But I'll tell you, the medics did a tremendous job. I recall, seems as though when we're in basic training and all, they would take the smaller, weakest fellow that maybe couldn't do everything, so they'd make him a medic. And we didn't think a whole lot about that, but you didn't seem to give him the same respect that you gave the fellow that carried the BAR or the machine gun or something like that. But after you were in combat, he was the top man as far as we were concerned. And when someone called medic, he was there. I don't care what was going on. He came out of that hole and went for it. You can't understand how that young man could do the things that he did. We lost a lot of them.
Did you keep regulation uniforms?
We went in combat with our fatigues on, and I think I had them on for 3 months, same pair. Never got any more. In fact, when we pulled out of Michigan, we could not let a fellow go out. We couldn't evacuate a man, and I don't recall whether he had to have 104 fever for 3 days or 103 for 4 days. But you did not evacuate a man just because he had a high fever, or if he was slightly wounded. Now, men had what we call trench foot, jungle rot, whatever you want to call it, and some of them would actually have to take their blankets and cut them up, couldn't wear their shoes, and just wrap their feet with that. But you couldn't evacuate them. We needed every man we could get. And it's, yes, the jungle, you have to learn the jungle. And I think this is what surprised the Japanese, the factor that we could adapt. We could adapt and be good jungle fighters. We didn't necessarily have to enjoy it, but we could be good jungle fighters. You know, you don't have morality. You don't have morality in combat. I'd say the first week or two you may have a little bit, but after that it just becomes kind of dog eat dog. And incidentally, we did have dogs. They sent a canine corps to us one time.
Did you ever get into hand-to-hand combat?
Yes, frequently. I remember several times. I remember the last time we were on the Burma Road, they overran one of our positions, and but our fellows were combat ready. And the Japanese had a strange thing that we learned. If they ran by a foxhole, they didn't do like we did. If you ran by a foxhole, 9 chances out of 10, you just threw a hand grenade in it and kept going. But they would stop and look into the hole oftentimes. And if a fellow was in there, he would wait. And if somebody looked into his hole, that was the last place he looked, because he was shot. And but I remember that night I was on the one side of the ridge, and the other side of the ridge got overrun, and they overran several machine gun positions, and I took some of my fellows, and we took machine guns and ran back and forth with machine guns and ammunition. And our concern was that we hoped they could tell the difference between who was running. Fortunately, they did. But that was the last time we had an encounter such as that. Because we actually, at one time, actually wanted them to attack, banzai attack, because we had so much superior fire, and we knew that they could not succeed, because they were decimated too. They may not have but a couple of hundred men, and they didn't do a very good job of sneaking up on us anymore.
How did you get your Purple Heart?
Well, you want to know where?
You didn't have to get that technical. How?
A lady saw a Purple Heart tag on my car one day, and as I got out, she said, "Where were you wounded?" And I couldn't help it. I reached for my belt. She said, "I'm in what country?" And I was hit in the ankle with shrapnel. 2 of us. We had made an attack and had to fall back, and they left one man out there, and another fellow and I decided to go get him. And we went out and got him and brought him back, and we got a little shrapnel in for our care. but we didn't get evacuated. Then another time I had a shell land in the back of my little bunker, and perforated both eardrums and gave me a concussion. And but that I went to the little portable surgical for that, and they cleaned my ears out and stuffed them full of cotton, and I went back to the unit. It's amazing, you didn't want to leave your unit. And I don't know why that was. I guess you feel like maybe you might be doing some good there.
You got close with the guys you were with?
No, tried not to. Oh, for a long time you were, but after becoming Sergeant Major, I had things to tell them. I recall when we would get a few replacements in, the first thing I wanted to do was scare the pants off of them. And I did not invent this. A fellow told me about it, and I would maybe only get 6 to 10 men in at a time. And I would seat them, and I would have them look at me, and I'd say, now, in fact, I talked to a fellow here a while back that called me on the phone and told me that he was scared to death of me, and I never have figured out why. But he said one thing, he said, I never saw you smile the entire time. You never smiled. But I would have them, I said, look at the man on your right. Now look at the man on your left. Now look at me. And I would hold up the 3 fingers, and I would say, of the 3 of you, 1 of you might survive. You listen to me, and you may be the one that survives. And it got their attention. But you always had 2 of them that wanted to stay together because they had basic training together. And I had an answer for that. When one would say, my buddy and I have been together since basic training. Can we stay together? Can we have the same foxhole? And I had a pat answer for that. Are you ready to see your buddy's head blown off? And that was the end of that question. No, I was not one of the screaming, cursing sergeant majors. I didn't find that necessary. It was not in my repertoire. But I normally didn't have to tell anybody but one time what was to be done. That was the name of the game, and that was the position. You listened to the man that was talking to you. I was extremely fortunate. Pack of cigarettes one night. I was with my battalion commander in his bunker, and been there for quite a while, and I was a heavy, heavy smoker. And he didn't smoke at all. And he said, let's go up to the observation post for a while. And when we got to the observation post, my foxhole wasn't too far. I said, Colonel, I've got to go get some cigarettes. He said, well, hurry back, I want to talk to you some more. And I jumped out and ran over and got in my foxhole and got a pack of cigarettes. And before I could get back, a 155 hit the observation post, and he was killed. And so you can't say that cigarettes are the most dangerous thing. Sometimes they can be helpful.
What do you think makes a good leader in that kind of situation?
I suppose it's an individual that one thing says, follow me. Another thing is, I think he exudes a little bit of confidence. It's like I had a squad one time taking them somewhere, and one of the new fellows said, Sarge, I'm scared to death. And I looked at him and I said, well, what do you think I am? He said, you're not afraid. I said, don't kid yourself, we're all afraid. I said, but we learn to tuck it under. We know we've got something to do, we do it. And we do it because it has to be done, not because we're brave, because it has to be done. And we had some of the finest leaders. And some of them were just ordinary people, but they could do the job, and you learned who to follow.
How did Merrill's Marauders get their name?
Primarily because they were designated the 5307th Composite Unit Provisional, and that's a mouthful. But remember, these men are all volunteers, and many of them have volunteered because their unit did not particularly care for them anymore. They were having problems with their units, and so I think some of them were told, now if you want to volunteer, we won't press this issue of court-martial or something. And they were a wild bunch, very wild. And they were, I would say the average age probably back then was probably 24 to 30 even. The replacements were much younger, but these fellows were free spirit. And when they got down into the South Pacifics, they still needed more men, so they asked for volunteers down through the Pacific and got a group of fellows from Guadalcanal that had already had a year combat experience. And these men brought a tremendous amount into it. But when they got over into India, they were kind of a wild bunch. And it wasn't unusual for a bunch of them to go into one of the local establishments and take it over. I recall one instance. In fact, a master sergeant was in a place, and there were a lot of British there, and the band played the British anthem. All the British stood up, and most of the Americans did too. And when they sat down, they played the Star Spangled Banner, and the British sat down. Well, this, and honestly, I did not know about this for years, but the fellow that stood up was a master sergeant with a .45 pistol, and he fired several rounds through the ceiling and explained to the British that he anticipated them standing up, and they did very quickly. They said he was one of the marauders, and I have no doubt of that. But he had a big mustache. Now, but that was before my mustache. It wasn't me, I'll assure you of that. But they did have a reputation of tearing a place up. And I understand later some of them actually stole a train and went all the way back into central India somewhere for seeing the sights. And finally the British stopped them, and they didn't do anything to them. They just turned and brought the train back and put them off. But they had a bad reputation. Well, they had a reputation, let's put it that way. I did not know that the unit was famous or infamous, because when I came home, I locked the door for 38 years. Did not say one word. Just I thought that was what you're supposed to do. It wasn't anybody's business but yours, and so you just kept it inside of you. You had nightmares, yes. Still have nightmares. And I guess I was old enough for it to make an impression. I saw my 23rd and 24th, no, I saw my 23rd and 24th birthday overseas in combat, and was very grateful to be able to see it. But when your major said I was over 35 years old, I realized then I needed to shave my mustache.
So how did that whole story come about? Tell me about the significance of the mustache, and why did you look so old for your
Well, first off, there was a ruling that you do not grow a beard. You somehow, now you might have a beard for 2 or 3 weeks or a month, But the first chance you had to shave it off, you were not going to have a beard. Well, mine got pretty heavy and the mustache was good and pretty good, so I just decided to keep a mustache. And I let it just continue to grow and grow and grow, and it became kind of the joke. That's a sergeant major with that big mustache. And if I could get a little cigar, that cigar and that mustache, and that old beat up helmet became kind of synonymous of the sergeant major, I guess. But I was not the sergeant major like John Wayne and those fellas. I was the tempered type that took the easy way out. But I was sergeant major for a long time. I was promoted first. I went overseas as corporal and had a squad of men, and they said that they were going to make me a staff sergeant, but they didn't. And then I took over as sergeant major, and the first promotions came through. Oh, we've been a long time after we even got out of combat, and the promotion list came through, and I made staff sergeant. And I think it was a week later I made master sergeant as sergeant major, and that was what I ended up, because I liked the fact that I was untouchable. Nobody bothers the sergeant major except the battalion commander. And what you say it for the battalion commander, whether you're speaking to an officer or whether you're talking to an enlisted man. But I had no problems with anybody, except one time. One time we got some new officers in, and of course in just a few weeks your uniforms are all the same. They're dirty. You don't wear any insignias. But I caught this fellow throwing hand grenades into empty foxholes, and I had a few words to say to him, and he informed me that he was an officer, then we would go see the company commander. I said, no, we will go see the battalion commander. And all of a sudden it dawned on me when we started back there that my battalion commander had been killed. This is a new battalion commander. I don't know how he's going to back me. So when we got to him, the lieutenant told him all that I had threatened to do to him, and when he stopped, the major was the new battalion commander, said, Lieutenant, do you know who I am? He said, yes, sir, you're the battalion commander. He said, do you know what my rank is? He said, yes, sir, you're a major, aren't you? He said, that's right. And then he kind of did his thumb and said, well, do you know who this is? Pointing to me. And the guy, I could see kind of surprise in his face because he didn't know who he had contacted. He says, this is Sergeant Major Mitchell. He said, now I'm a major, and he's a sergeant major. Now he outranks me by 3 stripes, so you consider you're behind well chewed. And when he said that, I looked at the lieutenant, he looked at me, and we both just cracked up because neither of us expected anything like that, you know. He and I became real good friends. But then the Major Latin turned to him and he said, Lieutenant, you better be glad it was the sergeant major, because it had been me, I'd have still been kicking you in the butt. But the major and I got to be real good friends too. As close as you want to be. As close as you want to be. You don't, for some reason you just don't want to be close to anybody after you've been in combat for as long as we were.
How long were you there?
I was overseas right at 2 years, about 22, 23 months. And of that, probably a year in combat. Mm-hmm. On and off. In other words, a lot of the times you're just moving. You're moving from one place to the other. You're behind the lines. You're equipped, and you're hitting something here, and you hit something there, mm-hmm. And but I guess it's just about 2 years I was overseas. Didn't seem like it was that long now. Mm-hmm. It was just the first 50 years of my life.
were relations with the British generally, between the British troops and the American troops?
Let me explain what British troops are. British troops are Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Africans, Indians, and maybe an Englishman occasionally. And they are very, well, their leadership is rather domineering. They do not go out of their way oftentimes to be kind and considerate. And of course, when you got this brash bunch of Americans that know it all anyhow, you don't really need to talk to them very much, because if you're not careful, a unit pulled up behind us one time, a British unit. They were going to be the governing force for Michigan. We did not know that. All we knew was that they had weapons, and they had trucks, and they had artillery. Some of our fellows, and I have no idea who it was, we'll never find out, went back and stole a 75 millimeter cannon and drug it through those jungles up to the front lines with 6 rounds of ammunition and fired those point blank at some of the bunkers of the Japanese. The gun is probably still in the mud, but it caused some dissension. But we lived on dissension. We didn't want many friends other than the supply people and the medics. And again, the evacuations, the medics were just tremendous people. And when you got back to a hospital, you felt like you had been taken to the finest hotel in the world. And the nurses were so kind and considerate, 90% of them. I know one time they took a fellow in there, and one of the nurses hollered, "Don't put him on that clean bed," because he was in a dirty uniform, you know. And he turned around and says, "Just put me on the floor. I'm more comfortable down there anyway." But of course they didn't. They put him on the bed. But
so you were in field hospitals then?
No. The closest hospital, you had to be flown to it. We had our battalion aid station, and sometimes they had what we call a portable surgical that would come up behind us, maybe 5-6 miles from us, that would take care of that. This only happened 2 or 3 times, but those people were sharp. They had probably 6 or 8 surgeons, and I'll tell you, I had just about as soon have one of the surgical assistants work on me as one of the surgeons, because they were just as good. I know they were not as good, but it seemed that they were as good. They just poured everything out for us. I think I was in one portable surgical, but just for a very short period of time. I was in one station hospital. No, one field hospital for a few days, but I finally got my battalion commander to come get me out.
Did you ever run across Joe Stilwell?
Yes, ma'am.
You did?
We were at Michigan, and it was raining, the weather was terrible, and there was a little rail line that they used to take Jeeps and take the tires off, and they could run over that little rail line. And they would take some trailers and make places on there to put litters. And they would come close enough, it was several miles from where we were, to evacuate the wounded at that time back to a little field hospital at that airstrip. They asked me to take my squad one day and go back there to meet some people. I thought it was going to be some replacements. And it was raining, and the Jeep pulled up and had about 4 or 5 fellows. And I said, this has got to be replacements. They've got new helmets, and they all got ponchos on, and we didn't have any of those. and they were milling around, and I walked over to him and I said, "Okay, you guys want to go to 2nd Battalion, let's go." And the first fellow turned around and looked at me, and I thought, this is not a replacement. This is an old man. He was probably in his 40s. And the next fellow turned around and looked at me with General Stilwell. And he says, "We're ready to go, son, anytime." But his son-in-law was my regimental commander. And I did not know that. And he did some things for us one day, and I was talking. He was one of the kindest men I've ever met, and he had gotten something done for us. And I turned to Colonel Easterbrook and I said, "You did that for us, didn't you?" And he smiled and he said, "Well, you know, it helps when your father-in-law is the commanding general." And being a rebel from South Mississippi, I said, "You mean Vinegar Joe is your pa-in-law?" And he smiled and he said, "Well, I prefer to call him General Stilwell." And I saw him at one of our reunions about 10 years ago, and went over and talked to him, and he reminded me of that. He said he was my father-in-law, not my pa-in-law. Had some things that young men just don't usually have happen like that. But there are so many fine people, so many fine officers in our unit, so many fine men that went on to accomplish things. In fact, one fellow that was a squad leader ended up retiring a 3-star general. But it makes you feel good when you get to know these fellows. In fact, this colonel that I'm speaking of, he retired a 3-star general also. Colonel Easterbrook. I've had a couple of letters from his son because of I had written a little article or two that got into one of the little things, and he read them and wanted to talk to me. No, I started many years ago looking into the histories of where we were and why we were there, and just started reading like The Greatest Generation and books like this. It just, my appetite, because I knew where they'd been. I knew the feeling you have, and I can read those books and walk right along beside those fellows in Italy and Germany, except I don't get cold like they do.
You stayed nice and warm, didn't you?
Our war was a small war. Our war was more like the Civil War. I mean, except we were far better equipped, and but we were on our own out in those jungles, and sometimes the closest unit would be 150 miles away from you, and you knew if those planes didn't fly over pretty soon, you'd have to start trying to figure a way to get out of there, because you would have no ammunition, you would have no food. You could survive for a while, but we were totally dependent on those men. Totally.
Well, you want to tell us about what's on your hat?
Not really.
Oh, yeah, no, explain it all. This is really cool.
That most of us fellows use that just kind of as a history of why we
My dad has one.
why we went in service. And
I see your discharge medal.
well, this was China, Burma, India. That was for the entire theater. And this is the combat infantryman's badge, what every fellow in the infantry gets if he's been in combat, and it's a very honorable thing to have. This is the presidential citation for the unit, that the things that we did. The president decided that we were to be cited for that. This is the badge that was made up for the Merrill's Marauders. And then the Rangers came from the Marauders and became a unit. This was my rank then. I was a sergeant major as a master sergeant. And this is some of the pins you get for Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. This was the old outfit I came from, which was the 65th Infantry. I later went into reserves and became a first lieutenant, and I was in the Medical Service Corps as a company commander and as an optometrist. That just about tells the story.
That's the whole thing. How'd you get the Bronze Star?
For going out and picking a man up and bringing him back between the lines. Didn't have anything else to do. There were two of us when I picked the man up.
He was wounded?
Yes. He was a lot further out than we thought he was. Once you got started, you just had to keep going. And it's a strange thing. You just feel like somebody needs to do it. And so you decide, let's do it. That fellow, when we got back, he said, if you hadn't have gone, I wouldn't have gone either. And I said, well, if you hadn't followed me, I'd have probably turned around and come back also. But you don't think about things like that. Mm-hmm. It's just something that's needed.
Mm-hmm. Here, tell us about the Bible, how you got it, and tell us about the picture.
I carried this the entire time I was in service. And most of it is turned to the 23rd Psalm. And if you've never read the 23rd Psalm, you need to read it, because it's the soldier's psalm. He leadeth me beside the still waters. But this was a picture that was snapped when I had a little mustache. We were up in the edge of the mountains, and it was real cool up there. I had a long sleeve sweatshirt on, and the planes had been looking for us for about 4 days, and we were trying our best to contact them by being up on the highest peak we could get on, which was pretty high. And while the fellow that's supposed to be twisting that had to do something else for a minute. And we thought we heard a plane, and I just got on it and started twisting. And I didn't even know this picture was being taken. But he took about 3 of these, and in one of them, you can barely see an old C-47 in the background coming toward us. They found us. And I think it had been about 4 days since they had made a drop, and we planned on that on the 3rd date, to have something to eat and make sure we got supplies. You know, at one point we got real distressed because we got a message, and I still feel like it was supposed to have gone to the Chinese instead of us. It was complaining that we were using too much ammunition in combat. And you know, what do you tell people when they say you're using too much ammunition? Well, you know what we told them. But I'm sure it was meant for the Chinese, because the Chinese were just notorious for using, on a machine gun, they would just use one belt of ammunition at a time. just go and go and go. Mm-hmm. We did not have a lot of faith in the Chinese helping us. So oftentimes, if you had 2 units, they would end up mistaking one for the other one, and they would fight for 2 or 3 days, and then they were were useless anyway. Well, I shouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that, because we even had them sometimes get some of them to come and carry litters for us. But they were the happiest bunch of people. Just, I remember what, and I shouldn't even, we were on this airstrip and I was trying to cross the airstrip for some reason, and they started shelling. And there were some Chinese there. And I saw a little depression in the ground. And I thought, if I can get to that depression, because they were shelling with 75 millimeters. And of course, that was the biggest I'd ever been under at the time, and they sounded like, gosh, they were so big. And I saw that depression, and I started running for it. And the Chinese was coming also, and he was ahead of me. And he dived into that little depression, and it was kind of like a cartoon. As he dived in, a 75 millimeter shell went in with him. And he didn't even stop. He just floated on off up in the air with arms and legs frailing and everything else. He and the 75 millimeter shell landed at the same time in that little hole. And of course, I didn't get in that hole. I just kept running. But it made an impression on me. I wasn't supposed to be in that hole. He wasn't either, but he didn't stay very long. Another thing happened one time. I was teaching a class. When I was in college, I was teaching a chemistry class. And I looked up on the coat rack, and there was a flight jacket with a China, Burma, India patch on it. And so I asked who does this jacket belong to? And this one fellow said, nice, tall-looking fellow, said, it belongs to me. I said, where were you in China, Burma, and India? Oh, he said, I was a pilot. I flew B-24 bombers. And I flew from, most of my missions were from China. But we had such a shortage of fuel, we would have to fly back to India and load these heavy tanks within the plane and fly that back for the next mission. And he said, where were you? I said, well, I was in Burma. Oh, he said, I'll never forget Burma. He said, we had to cross Burma. And he said, we were flying back with a load of fuel one time, and we lost an engine. And we knew we couldn't make it over the hump with 3 engines. And there was this little muddy airstrip below us, and the pilot finally, he was a co-pilot, said the pilot said, let's dump all the gas we have and then run out as much and see if we can land on that little strip down there. He said, the engineer says he can fix it in 15 minutes. So he said, we finally landed that plane at this little old muddy strip. He said, I can't remember the name of the place. But he said when the plane landed, said there were 4 of the raunchiest looking guys you've ever seen came out there and tried to scare us. Said they told us, said, you are in range of the artillery, and if you stay around this plane, the artillery is going to get you, because he said it's just right over the ridge there. He said, we would suggest that you get away from this plane. And that's when he said, well, the engineer says he can fix it in 15, 20 minutes. And the fellow said, well, you can stay here if you want to, but we're not going to hang around this place. And they took off. And he said, sure enough, he fixed it. Said we went out to the end of the runway, and said it was a short runway. And said we thought we had revved that plane up just as high as it would go. And about that time, the artillery started landing around the plane, and he said we found out we could rev it up a little more. But he said we finally took off, and said we took brush and everything at the end of the runway, but we did get off from there. He said, but I can't remember the name of that place. I said, it was Michino. He said, yes, it was. How do you know? I said, I was one of those 4 raunchy fellows that came out there and talked to you. We have such a small little world, don't we?